Okay, I'm back with you. This is Rob Johnson again with JMT Consulting. Today we are delighted to have Ken Cerini with us as our presenter and speaker today. Ken is the managing partner of Cerini and Associates. They're a Long Island, New York-based firm, CPA firm. They're also the presenter of the Long Island Imagine Awards, which is one of the things that they do for the nonprofit. Ken is the managing partner of the firm. He also heads up the nonprofit division, and they have about 200 nonprofit clients. When he's not working, he's looking for an extremely large hill to climb. But Ken is well known as a speaker and thought leader in the industry, and it's our pleasure to welcome him today as our speaker. And Ken, I'll allow you to take slide 2 and talk about the upcoming events that we have here at JMT.
Thanks a lot, Rob. So
sure.
Just kind of moving forward. So as Rob mentioned, JMT Consulting is having certain upcoming events that I think is important for the nonprofit sector to kind of think about and participate in. On August 8th, there's Nonprofits and Risk, which is a framework for a holistic assessment of organizational risk. August 9th, how to improve efficiency with AP automation. August 16th, abandon QuickBooks and take your nonprofit to the next level with Abila MIP. August 23rd, new revenue recognition guidance, which is extremely important with the new revenue recognition rules coming down the pike. And finally, on September 12th, financial transparency with Sage Intact. So JMT does an amazing job of bringing education to the nonprofit sector. So if you're not signed up for any of these or all of these presentations and webinars, you should think about it. Having said that, let's kind of move on. I have about an hour, and I have to, in an hour, get everything across to you guys about what social impact is and how to measure social impact, why it's important, and how to incorporate it into the messaging of your organization. One of the things that we have found is that there are so many organizations out there, and when we're seeing that the government has been cutting back on funding to the nonprofit sector, so nonprofits are looking for additional ways to bring on dollars. So in order to do that, they've jumped into the fundraising marketplace, and they're looking at how to attract funders, whether they be corporate donors, whether they be private foundations or individuals. And I think you find that with the information being so accessible these days, it really makes it much more difficult for the nonprofits that are out there trying to gain dollars. You have to find ways to differentiate yourself. You have to find ways to kind of get above that noise of all of the other nonprofit organizations out there. And one of the ways that you can do that, or one of the effective ways to do it, is to do it through social impact and showing that your organization has a high level of what we would call social return on investment. And one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that, this is, something that all donors have been looking at and talking about. Is kind of the hot topic these days. So when you think about it, every single nonprofit discussion out there, there's usually some sort of discussion about social impact and what social impact means and how do you measure social impact. And, everybody's trying to capture that elusive calculation of social impact. And I don't know necessarily that there is a one-size-fits-all approach to this. But, that's something that, each organization kind of has to look at and determine what's measurable and what's important to them. There used to be a certain level of faith in the good deeds that the sector did. That's no longer enough. I think you find now that the nonprofit sector has to prove its impact. So you have to be able to show and demonstrate as an organization that you are impactful. Just saying you're impactful is not good enough. They want metrics. Donors want to see some sort of calculation or some sort of studies to kind of get comfortable with the fact that you actually are an impactful organization like you say you are. Measuring impact has become the new mantra for the nonprofit funders and something that every nonprofit management team has been tasked to implement by their boards. Some of this is coming from the watchdog organizations like Charity Navigator. The old review of or look at a nonprofit organization and looking at how much money they're spending in a program capacity as kind of a good measurement of operational effectiveness, excuse me, is not necessarily the answer anymore. You know, they're looking for the ability to measure impact in terms of determining operational effectiveness. And again, it's supposed to be this holy grail that can be used to compare nonprofits across different industries. I don't know necessarily that they're going to be able to come up with a one rating system, but you know, there are ways that I think that you can take information and try to compare different organizations based upon, you know, the impact they're having from a dollars perspective or a numbers perspective, you know, but that's really what they're looking for, some way to kind of measure organizations. So if I'm looking at a health and welfare organization, or if I'm looking at an arts organization, or if I'm looking at a school, you know, I can kind of compare them and come up with one rating system or one way of really looking at them across the spectrum and saying, okay, this is the most effective of all of them. This is where I want to donate my money. When you think about social impact can be viewed on both a micro or a macro level. So when you think about the macro side of it, it's the impact that you're having on the constituents or the people that you serve. So an example of that would be, you know, 62% of the individuals that we trained had jobs 60 days after the training was over. So that's something that you look at. What's the impact on the people that we serve? And from a macro perspective, you know, you're looking at it from what is the overall impact on the community you serve or the environment or society in general. So again, an example of that would be, you know, the 62 individuals that we trained were on a welfare system costing taxpayers X number of dollars per year, and now they're gainfully employed paying taxes, which is having an impact on the local economy of Y. So, you know, one is really looking at how we've changed individual lives, macro, and on the micro, I'm sorry. And then the other is looking at the overall impact on the economy from a macro perspective. And, you know, I think when you're looking at measurement of social impact and looking at how you're capturing information, I think you really need to understand both, because the micro ultimately leads to the macro side of things. So what is social impact? So donors are interested in understanding how their funds are going to be utilized to make a difference. And as I said before, I threw out a term, social return on investment. And that's really what donors are looking for. You know, donors, like investors in the stock market, you know, they have different investment options. Donors have different nonprofits that they can fund. You know, so they're looking to ensure that the limited resources that they have, the dollars available for donation, are going to have the largest impact that they can possibly have. So again, I think that's where this whole look at social impact and this whole look at social return on investment has come from. Again, with more information available on the internet, I think you're in a situation where donors actually have access and are able to really do a better job of comparing organizations. The greater the impact and leverage that donated funds will have, the greater the overall social return on investment. So, you know, when we talk about leverage, leverage is how do I take, you know, a dollar spent and have a much more profound impact, or a dollar coming into the organization, I'm sorry, and have a much more profound impact than a dollar. So if I give you a dollar to use within your organization, what sort of impact is that dollar going to have in terms of the ripple impact? So to give you a kind of a good example of that is if you take an organization like Gift of Life International. So Gift of Life International is an organization that utilizes doctors to go to foreign countries and do heart surgeries on children. And one of the things they do is, as part of their mission, they purchase equipment, they bring the equipment to the foreign countries, they work with other organizations and collaborate with other organizations to increase the amount of funds that are available. The doctors, when they're there doing the surgeries, are also training doctors in those foreign third world countries on how to do the surgery. And when they leave behind the equipment that's necessary to do the surgeries. So what I wind up with is, for a investment of let's say, you know, $1 million in revenue that comes into the organization, I'm able to take that $1 million, and through the collaborations that I have with other organizations, I'm able to leverage that $1 million to $2 or $3 million. I get donated doctor time, which is worth another $3 to $5 million. we go down and we use that to educate other doctors in those foreign countries, which they're now able to do these surgeries on a go-forward basis. So I'm getting a sustainable annual return on that investment every year without any additional money coming in. So those are the types of things that you're looking at, and you're trying to figure out, well, how can I capture that information? How can I utilize that information and tell a story with that information to show the donor that there's real value in investing in your organization. So again, donors are interested in understanding, will you be back next year asking for money again, or is my donation going to create something that's self-sufficient? Can I leverage the dollar I gave you to create greater impact? And will the dollar I give you dramatically impact people's lives or planet or whatever? So this is really what's kind of meant by social return on investment and the direction that we see the donation world moving in. So I gave a kind of a definition there on this slide, slide 5, on social return on investment. And basically, it's a systematic way of incorporating social, environmental, economic, and other values into the decision-making process. So when you think about it, it's kind of a focus on a triple bottom line. In the past, the bottom line was, kind of a profit type bottom line in most businesses. Nonprofits definitely weren't profit motive, but you always had to worry about what was happening on the bottom line. Now it's kind of focusing on people, planet, and profit. So what's the impact I'm having on people? What's the impact I'm having on planet? And what's the impact I'm having on overall profit? And it's that triple bottom line that really fosters whether an investment has a great social return or not. And again, in order for you to look at that social return on investment, you need to be able to find a way to measure impact. And if you can't measure impact, it's going to really be hard to be able to talk to potential donors. So, how do you go about measuring that impact? How do you go about understanding and identifying what features or what components that you want to kind of track and measure? By the way, if anybody has any questions as I'm going through this, there should be a little question box. You can hit the question box, type in your question, and the question pops up. Moving along, so why is it important to quantify your success? Because measuring an organization's mission impact is no longer optional. I mean, when you think about it, and as I said before, it's no longer a situation of we want to do this, it's a situation of we have to do this. Overall accountability. Donors want to know that their funds are being used effectively and efficiently, otherwise they'll find another place to invest their donated dollars. Fiscal responsibility. You have been entrusted with, the funds. You have fiduciary responsibility to maximize their impact. And then heightened competition. As I said before, there are more and more agencies getting into the nonprofit sector. There are more and more agencies that are going after donated funds. So, there's a lot more competition out there. And how do you, again, rise yourself above the noise? You've got organizations like Charity Navigator that are looking at these types of statistics and pushing that information out to donors and trying to level the playing field in terms of how donors are viewing the different nonprofit organizations. And one of the things that Peter Drucker said, which I completely agree with, is if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. Part of what you want to do as a nonprofit organization is continue to find ways to create greater impact from the same dollars that are coming into your organization. So if you're not keeping track of metrics, if you're not measuring stuff, how do you know if you're doing better the next year or not? So it really comes down to being able to measure it so that ultimately the outside world can see what you're doing and the outside world can determine whether it's something that's effective. And also from an internal perspective, you can look at things from an internal perspective and see how you're doing things from an internal perspective. Moving on. Why is it moving? There you go. So why is measuring social impact so challenging? Well, it includes measuring complex concepts. When you think about certain things are easy to measure, how many meals you serve, if you're an organization that serves meals, but what happens if you're an organization that's providing counseling services? So, how do you look at the change in self-confidence that someone has? or how do you measure overall well-being of an individual? Some of these concepts are very, very difficult to measure. So when you look at things from that perspective, you're in a situation where, it's going to be much more difficult to measure these types of things. So again, it's looking at, and I'll get into it a little bit more in a few minutes, but it's looking at, what are the key factors that we deal with within our program, and then how do we develop a way of determining the impact that we're having. So in certain cases, you could do things like surveys and trying to get feedback from people. And then again, the other hard part is when you measure social impact, you have other factors that come into play. So if I'm an organization that gives books to teachers to be able to utilize in their classroom because the class or the school can't afford to buy those textbooks, how do I determine what impact the donation of those books had versus what impact the teaching methods of the teacher had? So it's not always easy to kind of parse out the impact that my organization is having versus the impact that's coming from external factors. Also, when you're thinking about measuring social impact, there's often long-term measurements that need to be looked at. So you're looking at requiring dedicated resources and input from outside sources. So again, going back to that whole aspect of counseling and changes in self-confidence, I could provide some level of counseling today, but what impact did that counseling today have a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and how do we track that individual through the system and say, how did that impact or how did that counseling change their life? And those are the types of things where, if I can look at it and say, individuals who have had counseling, 80%, let's say for argument's sake, I'm making up statistics here, but 80% of people who don't have counseling, wind up in one place, and 80% of people who have had counseling wind up in a different place. So how do you kind of measure the impact that you're trying to have? How do you measure or track the information that you're trying to track? And then what statistics or studies exist online that you can tap into? So part of when you're going out there and you're measuring impact, one of the things you want to do is you want to go out there and try to find studies that are online that kind of support what it is or the message that you're trying to tell, so that if you have those studies, then the information that you're tracking can lead to those studies and hopefully then get you some sort of showing the impact that your organization is having. It requires a robust tracking system. Many small organizations can't afford or don't have the ability to develop a tracking system to track some of these long-term impacts or long-term factors. No set standards or formats. So all organizations could have different ways they're approaching it, and every time you approach it differently, you could have different results. And when you're dealing with different results, and you go out there and you talk to a donor and you provide a fact pattern and you provide an estimate of impact, and that estimate of impact is not based on reality, it can undermine your confidence with your funders. And then also it's hard to share information between collaborating entities. If you're measuring impact one way, they're measuring impact another way, it gets tough. So again, I don't know that there's any real answers at this point in terms of how do we measure impact. We just know that it's something we have to do, and I'll get into, again, some more aspects of this. So what are some of the key components of that social return on investment? So one of the things we need to do is, again, we need to track spending. So how much does it cost to run the program? So cost is important because impact looks at investment and return. So if we look at how much we're investing in it, and then we look at the return that we're getting from it, that kind of lets us understand what our return on investment is. So that's why the first important starting point is really, what is it costing us to run the program? Then you have to identify what are the metrics we want to measure. So how many people are served during each cycle, month? So what is the most important thing that you need to measure within that program to be able to then develop the metrics that are necessary to show the impact of of your organization and the program? How will you measure it? How can you link the measurement back to impact? And that's kind of the hardest part is, you can measure certain things, but then how do you show the true impact that your efforts are having? And then that's what I said before, is going back to research. There are many studies that exist online. You need to go online and do some research and find studies that correlate your statistics to real benefit. So, if you think about it, so kind of an example would be if 62% of all minority high school kids attend college, and that's the statistic, let's say, that's out there online, that there have been studies to support the fact that 62% of all minority kids attend college. And you're able to show that the kids that attend your school, 72% of them attend college. You're able to show now that you're 10% higher than the industry standard. And because you're 10% higher than the industry standard, you can now try to equate what that 10% delta is in terms of economic benefit. So those are the types of things that you want to try to do. What are the studies that are out there? How do I compare myself to the studies that are out there? And then ultimately, how do I then measure that in terms of, or equate that to a measurable impact? So when we think about it, there's a lot of talk about outputs, but outputs are not necessarily outcomes. When we think about outcomes, outcomes are really the impact that you're having. Outputs are just the units of service or pure metrics that you're working with. So your inputs become, what are the financial impacts? How much money are you spending? Time, how much staff, volunteer time, and the like. Expertise, how much you're using in terms of consultants, partners, and everything else. Your outputs, like I said, are the pure metrics without considering the impact of those, such as the number of children served, patrons entering the museum, or the like. Your outcomes, your impact, is what is the effect on the community? What is the potential longer-term impact on, so it's not just what's the impact today, but what's our long-term factor? So when we think about it from a long-term factor, if I'm an organization that works with individuals who have been incarcerated, and what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to help them when they get out of jail to get new lives, to help them find jobs and everything else. If I can look at what the rate of recidivism is for traditional individuals that don't go through my program, and I can look at what the recidivism rate is for the individuals that go through my program. Again, I can look at what the savings on society is. So if a lot of these individuals, or X% of these individuals, would have wound up back in jail, that there's a cost to society with them being back in jail. There's the cost of what it takes to keep the jail running, to feed them and everything else. On top of that, there's multiple layers of benefit because, again, if I've kept them out of jail and now they have jobs and they're working and they're productive members of society, they're adding dollars to the overall gross national product. And it's trickle down because it's not just how much money are they making and how much taxes are they paying, but now with the money that they're making, they're spending that money and they're creating more jobs. All of that information exists online, and it's up to you to go find it and kind of research it. But again, I think it's the outcomes that are extremely important in terms of being able to take those outputs, the pure metrics, the pure things that you're measuring, and trying to create a way that you can show the impact that they're having. You're finding right now that data is kind of like the lifeblood of the donations. Like I said, your donors or your investors, they want to get a real understanding of how you're utilizing their money. And they want to know that if they're going to give you that money, that money is again, going to be meaningful. And there are so many organizations, they have so many options out there that if you can't clearly show the impact that you're having as an organization, they're going to find someone else to donate funds to. So again, it becomes a challenge. I know this is not an easy thing to do in terms of going out there and measuring impact. I know it's very, very difficult to look at some of the factors and try to understand what's the metrics that you're going to measure, but it's something that needs to be done. As I said before, I think, one of the challenges that you have, is when you don't have a clear measurement or an easy measurement where it's, how many people you've served or how many patrons are entered your facility, when you're dealing more with the life-changing counseling or, the books that you donate to an organization. I can donate books, but I don't know what impact those books are having. So, I think there what becomes a lot tougher is, yes, I know how many people I provided counseling services to, but I don't know how those counseling services changed each person's lives and how they moved those people's lives forward. And again, I think that's where, you're looking at other ways of measuring impact through surveys, through studies, through some of it's anecdotal in terms of, getting feedback from people. And that feedback, I think, can't just be a one-time feedback. How do you feel after you're done? But I think you have to track those people through the system and really look at where those people are, 1 year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, on through to see really the impact you had. And then you'll have a much better idea of, through long-term studies, of really showing how you're changing lives. Moving forward, how do we get to outcomes? So again, as I said before, you have to determine what available research or studies already exist. One of the things you should be doing when you're looking at your organization is, and you're looking at your programs, is go online, get an understanding from what's online in terms of, what research has already been done around some of the areas that you serve, and what studies have been done, what data is out there already, and the challenge is where to look, how to find it. Are there other organizations that are working within your industry that maybe you can kind of see what they've done so that you're trying to work with a consistent measurement? I'm not looking for anybody to recreate the wheel. You shouldn't have to recreate the wheel. Do some research and determine how studies that have already exist can kind of link into the measurements that you have to see if you can then create some real meaningful data out of those studies, out of the studies and out of the data that you've collected. As I said before, going from anecdotal to quantifiable is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. But if you can kind of look at things such as, study, let's say maybe there was a study that was done and the study shows that after attending a counseling session, individuals are, 10% more likely to do X or to have better self-confidence or whatever it is. You can kind of utilize those studies and kind of factor that in. Well, if 10% of the people who are attending studies or attending counseling services are going to, improve their lives by 5%, and I dealt with 100 people, you can translate that maybe into a meaningful number. Again, donors are also looking for leverage or that economic multiplier, as I mentioned before. I mean, you've got organizations out there that do a phenomenal job of leveraging. And when we talk about leveraging, we can talk about from a one-year perspective. You have food pantries, where the food pantry taps into other resources where they'll be able to collect food. So they collect dollars, $1 million, let's say, worth of donations. They collect donations of food that would have wound up in, the garbage. And, you got that food that would have wound up in the garbage. And now, especially for organizations that do food rescue from restaurants and stuff, that food now is getting out to individuals. Individuals are having meals. So that's a benefit to those individuals. We're also saving the cost that would have gone into, this finding its way into the garbage system. So that's just kind of a 1 year impact. But then you kind of look at certain things where some organizations have multiple year impacts. And what is that multiple year impact? So when you start looking at economic multipliers, I'll give you a good example of one in a few minutes. Those economic multipliers can be really profound. So I could have an economic multiplier of 1,000, 2,000 times, which is great, and that's what donors are looking for. And again, it's how do you value also lifetime benefits? That whole teach a man to fish theory. When we go back to what we were talking about before with the doctors and the gift of life, when we look at the overall benefit, it's not just the benefit of the surgeries that were done that year and the doctors that donated their time, but it's also the benefit of future years where because I trained other doctors on how to do these surgeries, these other doctors were able to provide these surgeries in future years. And I have that ripple impact of being able to continue to provide surgeries down the road. And then, finally, you've got, process implementation. How are your inputs and outputs organized? How do I have all this information? How do I gather it? How do I evaluate future impact, as we talked about? So ongoing monitoring to develop additional quantifiable results. So if I know that I'm looking at things in year 1, how do I look at it in year 5? How do I look at it in year 10? What are my processes and what have I put in place to be able to measure that on an ongoing basis? Again, if you're going back and you're looking at a child with developmental disabilities, and I've got a child who is receiving early intervention services, pre-3-year-old, and I'm looking to see what impact my education had on that child, I'm looking to see, okay, did that child wind up going back into the public school system, or did they continue in a special ed environment? Did they ultimately graduate from high school? Did they go on to college? Did they get a job when they graduated? So if you look at, the children who don't go through early intervention and see where they wind up, and you look at children who do go through early intervention, you can then leverage the kids and see the long-term results of your program. One of the things that you can ask yourself is, what happened if my program did not exist? When you're looking at impact. So what happens if we do nothing? So if we do nothing, going back to the, going back to the whole concept of the individuals being released from prison and recidivism. So if we did nothing, blank released inmates would wind up back in prison at a cost to taxpayers of X, versus being a productive member of society, contributing X number of dollars in taxes and X overall in economic benefit. If I can capture this information and I can make a statement about the impact that my organization has, and I can do it in a way that tells the story effectively, that's going to go a long way in working with your donors to be able to show that you're the type of organization that they should be donating to. Another example of what happens if my program didn't exist. If we spend X number of dollars to fund blank program, so many older New Yorkers will be lifted out of poverty and generate X dollars amount of economic activity in the communities and reduce reliance on government-funded programs by Y. So again, one of them is, looking at it from like if we do nothing, and second is if we spend money. So you can kind of look at if someone gives you $1 million and you're investing that $1 million into this program, what impact that $1 million, what changes would you have made in the lives of individuals? And if I make a change in the life of an individual, that change in that life of that individual will have an ongoing rolling impact. And that's the type of stuff that we need to try to measure. Again, numbers are just numbers. You need to kind of go beyond the numbers. You need to try to quantify your results. I mean, again, I can provide services to 1,000 people, but saying that I provided services to 1,000 people doesn't mean a whole lot. how do I now take the fact that I've provided services to those 1,000 people and turn it into something that's quantifiable and impactful? And then I need to take it and put it into a format or a presentation where I can tell the story in a compelling way. Again, just giving people data isn't necessarily going to tell the story in a way that's really going to help your organization grow. You need to find ways to tell the story effectively. You need to find ways to take the, as we said before, the outputs, the number of people that you serve, and convert that into impact and show that impact in a way that's effective. And also, finding the right mediums to kind of push that information out. You can push it out through websites and stuff like that, but you got to find the right medium for that. So how do you communicate your social return on investment? I think the first thing you need to do is you need to understand who your target audience is. Who's going to be looking at this information? Is it donors? Is it funding agencies? Is it watchdog organizations? So who's going to be, is it, if I'm a school, one of the things that I may want to do as a private school is I may want to be able to show my parents who are going to place their kids in my school that the kids who graduate from my middle school are winding up going to some of the more successful high schools. The kids that graduate from my high schools are going on to the top rated colleges. So by understanding who my target audience is, helps me to understand what information it is that I really want to capture and measure. Again, if I'm a private school, private high school, I want to capture where my students are ultimately going when they graduate. How many of them are graduating? How many of them going on to college once they graduate? What schools are they attending? Because this is the messaging that I want to get out to parents, because the parents are the ones who are ultimately going to make the decision. And if I can show that 70% of the kids that are graduating from my high school are going on to Ivy League schools, and what percentage of them are getting scholarships, these are all really important measurements. So you really have to understand, who ultimately is going to be utilizing this information, and then what do I need to measure in order to meet the needs of that target audience? How will they receive your information? So what format, what's the distribution mechanism that you're going to use to push this information out? What collateral should include your social return on investment? So again, what venues will it appear in? If I'm putting together something for parents, what I'm going to put together for parents might be different from what I put together for a grant. It might be different from what I put together for a funder, or it might be different from. So by understanding who your audience is, it'll help you to determine what the messaging that you want to put in place for each of your pieces of material. So again, different audiences, as I said before, could be potential funders. It could be the public, your members, volunteers. If part of what I'm looking to do is attract volunteers, I may want to have some metrics in there that really look at the volunteer experience and what volunteers are getting out of the experience. Maybe my audience is some community partners, and now I'm looking to work with these community partners who might provide good linkage for me, or might be looking to send individuals my way. I want to make sure that I got the message right to them. Could be the rating organizations, like I said, GuideStar on them. What are the different channels for pushing out the information? Again, you have Charity Navigator, grant applications, email. Some of the stuff that you can do is, you can send out email blasts and blog postings and stuff to get your story across to people, to your funders. Social media and your website, that's important. I think, everybody's website should have some aspect of social impact on it and how you're making a difference, and the whole aspect that we talked about regarding leverage in that. That needs to be on everybody's website. And then also, another channel could be in-person events or pitch meetings. If you're going to meet with someone, you want to have certain collateral and leave behind that you can show that if they make $1 million investment in your organization, what's that leverage and that multiplier that they're going to experience based on that investment. So certain key factors to consider in your messaging. So you want to make it count. So you want to quantify your impact wherever possible. So you want to make sure that when you're pushing your messaging out, that messaging is showing the impact that you're having, and it shouldn't be just anecdotal. That impact should really be quantifiable. You need to come up with metrics to measure. You need to come up with the studies that kind of link those measurable metrics to actual dollars and results. Make it clear. The more simple your message, the better it's going to be. You want to make sure that people can see it and can understand it. Make it fast. The attention span of the average person is about 8 seconds. So you want to make sure that that messaging is something that's easy to look at, that they can understand it pretty quickly, that they can grasp the concept and get the message really quick that you are an impactful organization and that you are making differences. Make it visual. The more appealing your content is, the more likely that people are going to look at it. People don't want to take the time to read thousands of words on a page. They want instant gratification. The whole world of Instagram and everything else has kind of pushed things down to small bite-sized pictures and everything else. The more you can tell things in picture format, the more visual you can make it, the better off you're going to be. So consider infographics when you're going through and putting together your messaging. I think the more you can do things through infographics, the more you can do things in ways that are easy for people to understand, the better off you're going to be. And make it a story. Try to connect your message through emotions. I mean, people, they're interested in that social return on investment, yes, but they're also still interested in the people. They want to see the faces of the people that you're serving. They want to know and connect to the people that you work with. And I think that's kind of even more profound in the millennials. I think within the millennials, there's that deeper look at connection, and the more you can kind of show that connection, the more you can make it real, the more you can kind of connect it to a story, but still have that quantifiable impact, the better off you're going to be. As I said before, you want to try to do things in terms of infographics where possible. So again, if you look, here's 2 examples of some infographics. So going back to that whole if we do nothing sort of approach. So if we do nothing, these 100 people will cost the public service system $7 million. The cost to change the lives of these 100 people is only $2.7 million. So when you look at it, if you invest in helping me work with these 100 people, there's going to be a savings to the public system of $4.3 million. So that's tremendous. So a $2.7 million investment is going to have a 2.5 times return on investment. If you look at the other infographic that's here, it outlines the program. So over the course of 14 months, students spend approximately 1,200 hours in training. So that shows the 14 months, 1,200 hours in training. It highlights the 4 interlocking program components. It shows that 96% identify as students of color. So it kind of gives the cross section of the demographics of the students that are being worked with. And then it says, for every dollar invested, you get a 13.46 economic return. And again, this all needs to be supportable and everything, but again, 13 times return on investment. And it's clear looking at this, they get the message across pretty quickly in the messaging that a dollar invested has a 13 times rate of return. And then it shows college enrollment rate of 93%. It shows degree attainment at 3.5 times the comparative group. And it shows that students who are graduating are coming up with median salaries of $40,000 to $45,000. So again, in one little picture, there's a lot of information, and it tells a really, really big story in a small amount of words. So the more you can get your messaging across in this type of format, the better off you're going to be. I know that I see that there's a question listed here. How can nonprofits?
Yeah,
Are there a bunch of them or just
Go ahead,
one?
Ken. I'm sorry.
Gonna
There are a few. Yeah, there are a few.
Okay.
If you'd like, I can read them to you.
Go ahead.
How can nonprofits know which measurements to include, considering there are multiple rating organizations, Charity Navigator, et cetera, that might have different metrics?
I think what it comes down to is which of the measurements are meaningful to the organization, which of the metrics are meaningful to the users of the data. So as I said before, I mean, when you look at and going back a couple slides, who the users of the data are, who's your target audience, I think that's really going to determine which metrics that you measure. So it's going to go back and say, who is it that is going to be utilizing this data? What's the most meaningful information for the people who are going to be utilizing the data? Part of it is, you are going to be concerned about the donors and the funders. So there, again, you're going to be looking at it from, if you're looking for investments in a particular program. And again, you have to look at, I've got this big agency that does 50 different things. Each program may have different metrics that are effective for that program. So again, this can get very, very time consuming. And I think you really have to go back and look at what are the most important components of what it is you're trying to measure. And based on those important components, I think that's where you have to kind of focus your time and energy. You're not going to be able to measure, 200 different things on a regular basis. You got to kind of boil it down to look at which are going to be the most meaningful, which are going to have or show the best results overall. And those are the types of things that you're going to have to try to measure. But there's, again, no one size fits all for all organizations. Every organization is going to have to do some internal reflection and figure out which are the right measurements that they need to work on in terms of being able to really come up with meaningful outputs that will ultimately lead to impactful outcomes. Are there other questions?
Yeah, there are. So, and this one is another question along the same vein. How important is it to have metrics that match rating organizations as opposed to having metrics that are more relevant to the constituents? So I'll stop with that. So that's one. I think it's the same. I think you tried to answer it. Just pretty.
I think you do have to be cognizant of the rating organizations because obviously everybody's looking to compare organizations, and it's not always easy to compare an arts organization to a health and welfare organization, and that's where some of the ratings in some of the rating organizations like Charity Navigator come into play. So you do have to be cognizant of what the rating organizations are doing and how they're going to measure you and how you're going to line up within the rating organization. So that's going to be important because, when donors and funders are still looking at those rating organizations and saying, how did you stack up within them? So that is going to be important, but it's equally important when you look at, other factors to make sure that you're measuring and providing proper feedback to other users of the data.
Okay, so this one's from me, and it's to you. So, Ken, you're a practitioner. You have 200 or so clients that are nonprofits. If one of your clients, if you're working with one of your clients how do you guide them on to get started on this journey of moving away from just creating a 990 to really creating an outcomes-based approach to their organization? How do they get started? If you're guiding them or if you're advising them, how do you approach that? So
good question, and there are two parts to that I want to kind of deal with, and I'm glad you brought up the 990. But so if I'm talking to a client, I mean, the first thing I'm looking to understand is, all right, so if I look at their program and I look at what their program does, the first thing is, what are the, as I said before, who are the users of the data? What is the story I want to tell? So the first thing I need to understand is, what's the story I want to tell? and what data is going to be meaningful to tell that story. Then I look to see, go online to find out what sort of research is available, that if I can get data, I can then link that data to surveys and studies that have already been done. Because if I can't link it to something, then it's meaningless data. So I need to find a way, or find data or surveys, I should say, that have already been accomplished, so that I can then take the data that I'm measuring and link it back into a study or a survey, so that I can get real results and real impact. Because otherwise, if I'm measuring, you know, X, and there's no way to get a quantifiable results from that measurement of X, then measuring X isn't going to do me any good. So I really want to understand what the story is. I want to understand what the factors that come into play are. What do I have that's measurable? And then how do I take that data and link it back into an ultimate story? And I can't link it to that story unless I'm going to do studies myself and come up with meaningful results from the studies that I do myself, or if I'm going to be going online and trying to find studies that have already been performed. One of the ways you can do that is, as I said before, go to other organizations that do stuff similar to you and see if they've got any statistics and studies on their website. Go online and just try to find some studies. It's going to take some research to do, but you got to go in and do your homework before you just start measuring stuff, because again, you need to be able to show that those measurements can transfer into something that's meaningful. The other
go ahead.
I was going to say, the other thing is, you mentioned the 990. I mean, one of the things that I'm constantly surprised on is that, you know, most of the time when we work with our clients, you know, our clients have us prepare the 990, which is fine. But page 2 of the 990 talks about program service accomplishments. And one of the things that I tell my clients all the time is, you know, that's something that you really want to have your development people and your program people fill out. Because if the 990 is the document that is the most looked at document, and it's out there on GuideStar, it's out there on you know, different websites and stuff, that page 2, which outlines all of your program service accomplishments, should really be talking about the impact that you're having, should really be talking about more than just this is what our program is. It should really talk about the outcomes that you're experiencing within your program. Because again, you want to catch people's eye. And if the first document they're looking at is the 990, you want to kind of start that whole messaging from the first document they see, and not start that messaging sometime later.
I got a tough question for you, and we appreciate the questions. And this is from Lisa. Can we have an example of how to go about creating and/or developing measurable outcomes for such things as self-esteem and well-being?
Those are not easy. When you're dealing with something like self-esteem or well-being, it really, you're gonna have to go back and try to do some sort of surveying. That's the only way you're going to be able to do it, is through some sort of survey, where you need to create a document that you can get do a survey of the individuals who've gone through your program, and what you want to do a baseline before they go through your program to find out how they respond, and then after they go through your program, have them take the survey again and see how they respond, and see if you can develop a metric that says, okay, based on the initial response, they had an average score of, let's say, 72. And after they were done with our program, they had an average score of an 82. So that's a 13% increase overall in self-esteem. And then you try to link it back to a statistic that may exist that says individuals experience more self-esteem, are 20% more likely to get jobs, or whatever it is. I mean, I'm sure there's something online that outlines that, but you're going to have to kind of work off a baseline to begin with. And then once you have that baseline, again, pre-counseling, then you can go after counseling or post-counseling and see then what the improvement that has been made is. But there's really no easy way to do something when you're measuring, you know, more soft type functions or soft type benefits.
Yep. So this feels like a three-part process for an organization. It's like you develop a hypothesis or an initial kind of, here's what we believe our outcomes are, we'd like to study them. And then you got to go study and research them to validate it. Either they are, and then there's this big socialization aspect of getting it on your website, getting it into the to the guide stars and the charity navigators of the world, or to your some sort of a pitch book that you were talking about. There's a lot of work that goes into figuring out a way to tell your story in a meaningful way based on the various constituents that you have.
Yeah, I mean,
this just
this
about
is not easy. Yeah, that's right.
It doesn't know. Yeah.
So I have just one before we continue. Just one thing real quick. I do want to send out a little thanks to Nonprofit Sector Strategies. I did use some of their slides when I did the presentation. So I just want to give a little shout out to them and thank you for allowing me to use some of their slides.
By the way, at jmtconsulting.com, we have, this is a topic that we've covered a number of times and have content out there on various forms of outcomes, kind of consulting and approach to developing outcomes. Ken, we really appreciate this. This is a great session. Really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And we appreciate you taking the time to do this for us.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of spread some knowledge.
Yeah, no, and if that's it, we are just about at the top of the hour. We want to get everybody out of here. We appreciate everybody on the session today staying with us. It was terrific. And with that, we'll conclude today's call.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.